Hello and welcome to the NorthStar Café. I'm your host, Meenakshi Iyer, founder and principal of NorthStar Solutions and Services, which is a boutique, future of work oriented coaching, training, and consulting practice. And we partner with mid career technology leaders, women in tech, and those who speak English as an additional language in their people and change leadership journeys. We work with them to help them become impactful people and change leaders. And the NorthStar Cafe is a space that supports our vision for leadership development. So it's a space for action-oriented conversations on leadership development, particularly at the intersection of people, process, and technology. And today's topic is emotional literacy as a leadership skill. And I know there's a lot of conversation around emotional intelligence, emotional EQ, emotional quotient, all of that. And we're hearing the word empathy as a leadership skill being thrown about quite a bit. So, what on earth is all this, and how do we make sense of it all as human beings, and particularly as leaders? Whether or not we have teams that we lead, but regardless of that, how do we what is this all about, and how do we develop this skill? Is it possible to develop this skill? So those are some of the things that we're going to unpack today. And to help us do that, I have the honor and pleasure of having a very special guest, Dan Newby. And he is the founder at School of Emotions. He's an author, a coach, and he's worked with coaches in developing coaches in their professional development for many, many years. If I first met Dan just a few weeks ago at an ICF webinar, a live webinar where Dan talked about emotional literacy, and that was really my introduction to that topic, and I was so fascinated by that. Dan, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today. So appreciate that.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. And I remember hearing you say during the webinar that you originally from the US, but you're now live in Spain for many years.
Yep. So I'm American. I had the privilege when I was young of living overseas, and then about 12 years ago, I met a woman and moved to Spain to be with her, and we're married. And so I've stayed here, and for me now, it's home. And I still come to the U.S., of course, but southern Spain is home now.
That's fantastic. Absolutely. And I know I would invite you to share a little bit more about yourself, your background, and what got you into emotional literacy.
Sure, I'm delighted to. So I, as I said, grew up in various places in the world, which helped shape the way I see the world and I see life. I was trained as a teacher, but I never taught. Then I went into business, and I worked at virtually every level of business, from loading trucks to driving trucks to being a manager and an estimator and leading a team and helping found companies. So I spent about 20 years working in organizations and in leadership. And then I kind of stumbled upon coaching. And I actually went into coaching. I did coach training because it was recommended to me to help me improve my leadership skills. And that's what I was. So I thought that was a good idea. Unbeknownst to me, I was stepping onto a path that I'm still on today, 23 years later. So that's what got me into coaching. And I went through coach training like everybody goes through coach training, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And I actually didn't call myself a coach for a year or two because I was a leader in an organization. But more and more, what I recognized is that what I loved about being a leader was that I could help people grow. I could give them opportunities and create teams, and I enjoyed that part, the people part of being a leader. And I realized that, oh, well, coaching could help me do that directly rather than through an organization. So I stepped outside of the organization I was with, and I began coaching, and I've been working in that ever since. But the question about emotions is a little bit different because there's two impulses, I would say. The first is that in my late 30s and early 40s, I lived some very, very, what I think of as dark years, really difficult years of not living in alignment with what I profess to be my values, at least, and damaging relationships, and really living a life that there was a lot of turmoil and chaos. And I thought that, either there was something wrong with me, or maybe life was just that hard. I wasn't quite sure. But little by little, I started getting the idea that what I was missing, or that what would be useful, was to understand more about emotions, because it seemed like my emotions were driving me to do things, and they were kind of running wild, you might say. And I had all this energy, but I didn't know what to do with it. So I didn't know how to, people said, well, you got to control your emotions, but somehow that didn't feel quite right. And so I began little by little to realize that, oh, what was wrong, or what was missing, was I was emotionally ignorant. It's not that there was anything wrong with me intellectually, or that, there was anything wrong with me as a human being. It's that, well, I just didn't know anything about all this energy that I felt that was driving me. Of course, then if you think about emotions in coaching, well, lots of people have that same experience. They don't know what to do with their emotions. And if we think about the idea that emotions are the energy that moves us, so ambition moves us in one way, and joy moves us in another way, and complacency moves us in another way, well, then you begin to see that, oh, so coachees are challenged by something, and they have a story about it, about why it is. But what I find is that if we begin to look for the emotions that are related to their challenge, or sometimes we say breakdown, is that, okay, there are emotions that are not serving them in some way, or that are barriers to them doing what they really want to do in life. So this is how I began more and more to focus on emotions. And now all of my work is around emotional literacy, and with coaches, but also with leaders, with teams, with educators, with even therapists, is that my work, what I care about, is helping people become emotionally literate for two reasons. One, it helped me so much that I think it can help other people, surely. But also, all of the people I've trained over the years say the same thing to me. Like, wow, I had no idea what an impact, learning about my emotions and learning to navigate them and listen to them, how different life could be.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And I love, what you said. The emotions are the energy that move us, and we're all energy beings at the end of the day. And that's and energy beings that also have the ability to exercise choice, right? And that's what makes us so different or unique from in the ecosystem here. A couple of things that popped up for me, and I remember you sharing the story in the webinar where I first met you as well. And I wanted to actually start off this conversation with this question: what is the difference between emotional intelligence and emotional literacy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And well, if you think about all of us, at least I think most of us, when we were young, were given an IQ test. And the purpose of taking an IQ test is to assess your intellectual capacity and your knowledge, but it has to do with, your reason and your thinking. But it doesn't actually change your intellectual capacity. What we do to help people grow intellectually is that we teach them literacy. We teach them the alphabet, we teach them to read, we teach them to write, because that does two things. One, it gives them access to what's happening intellectually, but also it's a tool to help expand their intellect and their knowledge. So then if we take one step to the side and we think about emotions, right now we're in the process, many people, of taking emotional assessments, or EQ assessments. And what's that? Well, I would say it's analogous to an IQ test. It helps us see where our strengths are emotionally, what might be lacking, what we might strengthen, where our blind spots might be, but it doesn't actually change our emotional capacity. It assesses our emotional capacity. In order to grow emotionally or to take advantage of our EQ, what I believe we need is emotional literacy, just like linguistic literacy. And the way we develop that, for me, there's 4 steps. They're not that complex, but it's something we haven't focused on. We haven't taught people to do this. And so people don't recognize that there's a methodology and a process and a logic to emotions that if they learned it, they would be able to, they would be empowered really to leverage their emotional energy in different ways. So for me, it's very much an analogy to what we do intellectually. But if you think about it, we began giving IQ tests 80 years ago, or it was 80 years from the time really IQ tests became common to EQ assessments. So we're kind of 80 years behind in terms of this process. And so most of us are really emotionally illiterate, or even, I would say, emotionally ignorant. We just don't know. But we have the opportunity now to learn in that way. And what's interesting is that in many places, for instance, in school systems that I've worked with, there's a mandate from the government to teach social emotional skills to children.
Yeah.
Well, that's lovely, except the problem I run into is that most of the teachers are also emotionally illiterate because they grew up learning what they learned, but it wasn't about emotions. So we're in the process, and it's growing and it's expanding, and we're seeing it in lots of places. But this is my work, is to help people who want to grow emotionally and to put emotions to work as a tool and a life skill to help them get on the path and see what steps they need to take to do that. Like anything, it takes lots of practice, but once you understand the process and once you understand that it can be done, and once you kind of see where you're going, then a lot of it you can do for yourself if you're committed to it.
So well said, well put. And I loved your analogy of IQ tests and EQ tests. One of the things I often talk about and do work on with my clients is what I call as like full body leadership, leading with our head, heart, and hands. And in corporate environments, particularly, it's changing now. And I agree with you, we are 80 years behind, so there's a lot to catch up. But in corporate environments, typically, your intellectual smarts is what people look for in leaders, and that's what leadership models typically. What leadership is modeled in organizations typically looks like, and also leading with your heart or even talking about emotions is considered to be such a feminine trait, and there's a whole gender inequity component that comes in as well. So love the work that you're doing and your definition around the distinction that you draw between emotional intelligence and emotional literacy.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. One thing I would say is, it's not just mine, is that, if you read Daniel Goleman, he says the same things. You read Antonio Damasio, he says the same thing. So it's not my idea, it's an idea. But I find it to be quite solid in terms of the work I do and, the conversations I have with people and watching them grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I just wanted to also invite folks that are watching us live to hop in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. And if you have any questions for Dan, would love your inputs into the conversation as well. And also want to acknowledge and thank people who watch the recording. So we are in episode 12 of the NorthStar Café, and we're speaking with Dan Newby about emotional literacy as a leadership skill. So moving on with the conversation, Dan, wanted to understand, you've helped us understand what emotional literacy is. Can you take that one step further and talk about how it helps us all in work environments?
Sure. Well, the fundamental thing I would say is that if we think about emotions as moving us, then clearly they're at play at work, right? We show up to work and we have a certain emotion, and then something happens and the emotion shifts. So we're constantly in an emotion. We're never not in an emotion, in fact. So, if you imagine yourself at work as you go through the day, you may not notice the emotions that are triggered, but if you did, you would see that you experience hundreds of emotions in a day. Now, we kind of relate to emotions in two ways. One is we just live them, we have the experience of them, and we don't really notice them. But another way that we can experience them is we can learn to step back to ask ourselves, wow, what emotion am I feeling? What am I noticing about my emotions right now? So the reason this is valuable is it's really for some very, serious, hard reasons. If you think about the emotion of resentment, for instance, resentment occurs when we believe that we've been treated unfairly in some way. Well, all of us at work have felt at some point like we've been treated unfairly. Either we weren't given a raise, or we were asked to do more than somebody else, or somebody else, it appears, isn't working as hard as we are. Somebody else gets a credit, right? There's lots of things that happen at work that through our eyes appears to be unfair. When that happens, we feel the emotion of resentment. Now, if you think about what do we feel like doing when we feel resentment, well, for me, our impulse is to get even for that perceived unfairness. So think about a work environment. What do people do to get even when they believe they've been treated unfairly? Well, they do things like withhold information. They do things like they delay reports. They delay doing things. They sometimes steal paper clips or paper, or fudge their expense report a little bit. They do things that may not have a big impact, but it's all under the guise of trying to create fairness in their eyes. They did this to me, so I'm going to do this to them. But if you learn about resentment and you learn that, oh, resentment is telling me that I feel something was unfair, then I have two choices. One, I can try to make things more fair. I could go talk to my boss. I could, make a request. I could lodge a complaint. Right? There's things I could take action on that might resolve that perceived unfairness. But there are times when we can't. There's nothing we can do. It is the way it is. We don't have the power to change it. In that case, we have a couple of emotions that we could select, and one is tolerance. I could put up with it. I could endure it, even though I still think it's unfair. Or I could declare acceptance, which means that I would say, well, I'm not going to fight this anymore. It is the way it is. It's not that I like it. It's not that I agree with it. It's not that I think it's a good idea, but it is the way it is. And I'm not going to change it. So we can, in my words, navigate the emotion of resentment. So if you think about that then in terms of, your team, if you're a leader or the broader organization, resentment is always there. It's somewhere in the organization. But if you, as a leader, notice, seems like somebody is doing something to get even for something, well, it's a great place to have a conversation about, do you feel as if something unfair has occurred? And maybe they don't know how to have that conversation. Maybe they feel timid about having that conversation, or they feel fearful about having that conversation. Nonetheless, the resentment is at work. It is still doing something. It's still having an impact. So what we can do, and the reason I think being comfortable and fluent with emotions is that then we can have that conversation. Because if we feel like emotions are, oh no, it's too uncomfortable, or it's too embarrassing, or it's too intrusive to have a conversation about emotions, then we can never have that conversation. We can never help the person understand why it appears unfair to them,
Mm.
and we can never help them make a choice to move out of the resentment. The resentment just sits there
Yeah.
until they get exhausted, or until they feel like they've gotten even enough. Yeah, and so there's a lot of emotions in an organization that we never address because we don't have the perception, we don't have the language, we don't have the comfort. And what I see is that it's a tremendous opportunity. You think about,
Mm.
wow, how would organizations change if we just lowered the level of resentment in an organization, or if we addressed uncertainty in the organization,
Mm.
or if we addressed something like injustice in an organization, or if we generated more celebration through joy. Well, that's all about emotions.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, there's so much to unpack there, Dan. Thank you. And I loved how you, described so beautifully both sides of the equation. In this case, the example of resentment as the emotion, and then the person experiencing it, and the folks on the other side who are
Mhm.
perhaps seeing it, or the organization and the leadership. What came to mind for me is, and I know you mentioned this as well before, and something Professor Susan David talks about, and one of the things she says in her book on emotional agility is, emotions are data, not directives.
Mm.
Right, so they are telling you something.
Mhm.
They are not the instruction themselves, right?
Yep.
That's what came up for me when you shared that example.
Yeah, I would say in the same way that thoughts aren't directives. If you
Yeah.
think of doing something, that doesn't make it a good idea. It doesn't mean
Yes.
you should do it. It means, oh, it occurred to you, you might do it. And
Yeah.
then you have to choose. And you choose based on, well, what do you want to achieve and what are the consequences going to be? And with emotions, I think it's quite the same, is that,
Mm.
we can sit in resentment. We can stay there. We can live. It can become a mood in our lives. But the question is that what you want? Is
Yeah.
that what you want for your life? Is you want to live in the emotion or the mood of resentment? It's pretty it's pretty uncomfortable for most people. It's not really very generative. So
Yeah.
what I see is that all these emotions that sometimes we think of as negative emotions, or we say they're
Yeah.
bad emotions. For me, what they're doing is they're trying to alert us to something. They're giving us
Yep.
data. This is what you're experiencing, so pay attention.
Yes.
But it doesn't then tell you you have to do something. You have an impulse to do something, but you don't have to do that. You still have choice. Yeah. Now,
Absolutely.
you may do it out of impulse and then regret it, which is another emotion. But then we have this lovely tool called the apology, which is, oh, you're right. I reacted. I reacted in a way that it's not in alignment with my values. I don't think it's appropriate. Yeah. So please accept my apology. And I'm going to address that. So, we have this opportunity to try to, right the boat, as it were,
Hmm.
even when we take a misstep emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, and something else came up for me as you were sharing, especially around resentment, Dan,
Hmm.
and with everything that's going on, particularly in the technology space, where layoffs have become the norm, as
Hmm.
you've been, we all have been seeing on LinkedIn, and particularly on LinkedIn and other places. Um, how would you? What would be a couple of pointers from an emotional literacy standpoint that you can offer to people that are experiencing that loss at the moment?
Hmm.
A loss of a job can mean a lot of things for different
Sure.
people, depending on where they are in their life and their career.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing is to listen. Listen to the emotions, because if you're sad, what does it mean? It means you lost something you care about. If you feel fear, what does that mean? Well, you think there's danger. If you feel anxious, what does it mean? Something bad may happen. If you feel uncertainty, what does that mean? Well, you don't know what you're going to do tomorrow because you don't have a job anymore. So listen to the emotions, because they are telling you something. And in a way, they're telling you truly where you are. You are here. This is what you are experiencing. And one of the things that, we like to do is we like to ignore that, or we like to dismiss that. We like to wish we weren't feeling that. But you are, and your emotions don't particularly care if you want them there or not. They're just there. They're telling you what is. So we need to listen to them. But then the next step is to think about, well, is it serving me? Well, it may. For instance, if you're sad, what does it tell you? It tells you you've lost something you care about. Well, that points directly to your care. So, what is it that you've lost? And in your job, it's not that you cared about everything in your job, but there's some things about your job that you truly did care about. There's some obvious ones. You got paid, you got acknowledged. There are things like that, but there's also other things that were fulfilling for you in that job. If you can identify those, what you truly care about, do based on your sadness, it'll also help point you to what's the next job you want to look for, because it may not be identical to the job you just were let go of, let that you no longer have. Is that, so emotions, even though sadness, it doesn't feel very good. Most of us don't enjoy it, and most people in our lives are not very comfortable when we're sad. They would like us to move on from it. But I would say take a moment and listen to it, because it's telling you something. And if you can hear that message, it may point you to your next career, your next job, or to new ideas about what you might do next. Right? If you're feeling resentment, okay, we already talked about that. Right? If you're feeling disappointment, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you it was unexpected. Right? You had an expectation or a hope that your job would continue. You wouldn't be one of the people who was laid off. That's not reality. So disappointment is simply saying, you know what, reality and your hope or expectation are not in alignment. So we need to look at, well, what's reality? Reality is we don't have that job anymore. We've been dismissed. So I think if we pay attention to our emotions, and we don't simply sit in them, but we get curious about them, why is this showing up for me? And then the next step, and this is what, emotion-centered coaching is we know where we are now. If you came to me and you said, I have this situation, I was just dismissed from my job. Once we got to, well, what are the core emotions for you? You might say sadness and disappointment. Those are great. But the question is, when those are no longer serving you, then what emotion is going to help you move forward? What emotion is going to help you move into the future? And this is a fantastic question, because the answer is different for every single person. I might say adventurousness. I'm going to go out and I'm going to find something new that I love to do that I've never done before. So adventurousness might be the emotion that fuels me, right? Somebody else might say ambition. Somebody else might say self-compassion. Somebody else might say faith. People would have their own response to that.
Yep.
And you could go through any list of emotions and you could say, what emotion do I think is going to help me at this moment to move forward? And it's interesting, because once you choose that emotion, you're quite committed to it, because you thought it up, right? It makes sense to you.
Yeah.
It may not make sense to other people. It might not make sense to me, even if I was your coach. But what's really important is it makes sense to you. And then what you need to think about is, okay, what's the story? What am I going to think in this emotion? What am I going to tell myself? What's my belief going to be? And what's the energy going to be? How am I going I'm going to bring my body into this. So
Mm.
I can embody that emotion to move through these emotions that have shown up as a result of the experience to where I want to be.
Mm.
And it's really quite a simple idea, but it helps to, have the vocabulary and have somebody asking you the questions. But one of the things I would assure listeners is that we have this latitude as human beings. We
Mm.
can do this. We can learn to do this consciously. What has happened is it's never been in the curriculum, right? We've never been taught that these are possibilities. And so sometimes at first they seem a little odd, or
Mm.
we have trouble quite imagining how that would work. So I would just invite reflection on, when's that happened to you in the past and how could you make it more conscious?
Mm. Wow, that for me personally felt like I was sitting in a coaching conversation. Then, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And towards the end that you shared, that really alluded. It's already made a segue to one of the questions that I had for you: is what might be getting in the way of us focusing on emotional literacy? And you already mentioned that's something that we don't focus on as part of our education system. It's not something that's encouraged either, and we're seeing that shift at least in work environments, and yes, we're also seeing that shift in school curriculum and school systems, but it's not as much as we would like. And again, going back to we're 80 years behind, right? So could you talk to us a little bit more about this?
Sure. Yeah. So in the years I've been working in this area, I've seen tremendous change. Like I said, it's been mandated by governments, is that, in lots of organizations or in lots of, executive searches, now emotional assessments, emotional intelligence assessments are common. And in organizations, sometimes I'm asked just to do training on emotional literacy.
Mm.
So, this happens. It's, people are more and more moving in this direction. I think that the biggest barrier has been awareness. So I think what Daniel
Mm.
Goleman did when he articulated emotional intelligence was a tremendous gift, because people woke up to this idea like, oh, wow, maybe there's something there. And of course, there's been lots of people writing about that for a long time, but something about putting, emotional with intelligence, those two words together, was pretty magical for many people and got their attention. So I think the first step has been awareness. The second one is that we live with lots of, I would call them misunderstandings about emotions or myths about emotions, like, the proper relationship is you learn to control your emotions, which that one I'm quite skeptical about, because I can't control my emotions, and I'm not sure I would want to, because emotions help us react to whatever situation we're in. So for me, there's a new relationship, which I call navigating emotions. The
Mm.
idea that emotions are either positive or negative. Right? So the judgments we have about emotions, is that men don't cry,
Mm.
women are too emotional, blah, blah, blah. And there's so many of these that we need to, I think, challenge or reconsider. The idea that even emotions are a domain of learning. I've had many people say to me, if we're talking about emotions and, could you learn to react or respond out of anger
Mm.
differently? The answer is sometimes, well, that's just the way I am. And I think, oh, well, what that points to is that there's a belief underneath of that person cannot learn emotions or to work with them, navigate them differently.
Mm.
And in my experience, that's not true, but it's still a very common belief. Two more are: one is emotions get in the way of clear thinking, which neuroscience says that's silly, is that you can't separate emotions and thought. And so
Yep.
the idea is that, well, if you shift your emotion, you'll shift your thoughts. So maybe what we need to focus on is, how do I learn to be more emotionally agile so that
Mm.
I can think in the way that serves the moment? And that's an idea that most of us really haven't considered very much.
Mm.
And I think the last one in terms of organizations is, we have this very long standing belief that you should leave them at the door.
Yes.
And I think that is really quite naive if you stop and think about that, because what that would mean is that we leave loyalty, compassion, service, ambition,
Mm.
inspiration, and on and on and
Mm.
on, all
Yep.
these emotions at the door. And every organization I know of wants those. They don't
Yes.
want you to leave those at the door. And I think to be more clear that no, the emotions that we are saying leave at the door are the ones that are either uncomfortable for us or that we think cause a lot of havoc in some way.
Mm.
Right there, and so leaving anger at the door, all right, leaving, we could put a whole list there. But I think a better approach is to say, look, you're always in an emotion. You can't screen out emotions and leave them outside. It won't
Mm.
work that way. All the emotions are here. It's just that we haven't learned to first listen for them and being
Mm.
able to articulate them clearly. And two, we haven't seen that every emotion can either serve us or it can be a barrier. You can have a team that's ambitious. In fact, they're so ambitious that they don't pay attention to their clients, or
Yeah.
they lie to their clients. They're dishonorable to their clients, or they don't respect their clients. So ambition, although it's an essential emotion, and although it's core in every organization in some way, what's interesting is we can have so much ambition that it undermines what we're trying to do.
Mm.
So it's not that a certain set of ambitions or emotions are the right set of ambitions to have in an organization. We all have all the emotions. What we need to be able to do is to articulate them and say, oh, you know what, in this team at this moment, there's a lot of skepticism, but actually that's really good because it's helping us challenge the idea that we have and look for the faults or look for the weaknesses in it. So let's all put ourselves in skepticism, right? But
Mm.
then, if we stay in skepticism intensely all the time, it won't serve, because sometimes we need other emotions.
Yeah.
So again, to become more emotionally agile, to be more emotionally comfortable, to see emotions as normal, or what I would call normalizing emotions.
Yeah.
I think all of these are things that allow emotions to be used and for people to be curious and learning about emotions. So I feel like things are moving in that direction. To be honest, I don't have any doubt about it. I see it every day, all the time. And I think there's a tremendous amount to learn because, all of us, we spent 95% of our time in intellectual development, and we spent almost no time in emotional development.
Yeah.
And we've thought about emotions as being a tool for therapy. We haven't thought about emotions as being a tool. Oh, apologies,
No
there's
worries.
somebody ringing my doorbell, but we're not going to answer right now. So we haven't thought about emotions being a tool for leadership or parenting, or
Mm.
even to design relationships, with partners or with our family or neighbors. And really, we can look through the lens of emotions in all of those situations, and we can do a better job at all of them when we bring emotions into the mix.
So well said. And so well said. And I love how you called out, uh, how we spend so much of our time on our intellectual development and not so much, hardly any on emotional development. And it's kind of ironic and sad and surprising, shocking, all of it. Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, uh, and we are nothing without emotions, right? And it's an integral part of who we are, our being and our doing, and even a lot of our decision making is rooted in emotions, whether we care to admit it or not. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, and
Yeah.
I go ahead. Sorry.
Well, just from my perspective, I have moments when I might feel sad about it, but on the other hand, I look at intellectual development and I look at, all that it's given us, all that it's given me
Hmm.
personally. And
Hmm.
I think, what an incredible gift. Isn't that amazing, to have that? And I also, because I see emotions as a domain as much as intellect, I think, you know what, we have as much possibility emotionally as we have intellectually. So all
Mm,
of this effort we put into intellectual development, if we were to choose to, we could put a tremendous amount of energy into emotional development. And if you think about the benefits that we've all gotten from intellectual development, wow, to think we could replicate that if we were just simply to pay attention to our emotions and grow emotionally and build our emotional literacy and, make them a tool in our lives. For me, that's very hopeful because I think, that would change the way we
mm,
relate to each other. That would change the way we relate to nature, to the world, to the universe. It would change the way we relate to ourselves, how we care for ourselves or don't care for ourselves. But a lot of times we do all of these things out of habit or
mm,
simply because we're mimicking or we're modeling what other people did, what our parents did, or what was done in our culture, or what was done in our community, or what our friends did. And so I think that when we step into this domain of emotions and take responsibility for it, they're my emotions. So it got triggered by something out there, maybe, but now it's here and I have to do something with it. And so for me, that is a very empowering step to take, I think, for anybody, because then we're in choice. We're in choice in a way we were never in choice before.
yeah, yeah. Um, that was such a generative perspective on the importance of emotional literacy and focusing on emotional development. And you actually you have left me feeling inspired to think about it in this context, that look how far we have come with our intellectual development, and it's a matter of becoming aware and pivoting with the same level of intensity and intention towards our emotional development.
Hmm.
And that's
Yeah,
such a huge opportunity, right?
yeah,
And that's absolutely fantastic. And
yeah.
I see a comment here from Brandy, wanted to take a minute. So she's going to catch the replay. We can learn to do this. That's one of her big takeaways.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
yeah.
And what I see, the model I use for learning, in particular in the area of emotions, is that there are three steps. One is awareness, one is
Mm,
choice, and one is practice. And
mm,
so, we're building awareness. That's, what this conversation is about. It's not elevating anybody's emotional competence, but it's making them aware, which is the first step always. And that's happening in organizations, happening with leaders, happening in lots of places. And in fact, I have lots of leaders now who,
mm,
when they ask me to coach them, they say, you know what, I did an EQ assessment. It tells me I could do way better. Where do I begin? And I
mm,
want coaching, but as much as I want coaching, I want you to help me build my emotional literacy or my emotional
mm.
competence. So there's a lot of awareness, and that is a choice, right? That's when somebody
Yes.
says, this is what I want. I'm going to do this. I'm committed to this. And I think that, that mandate from the state of Michigan, that's a choice, right? Somebody is making a choice. Now, we may not know how to do that yet, but
Mm,
there's a choice. And so then I think it's, how do we practice? What are the practices? And the practices for me are, there's really just four. One is noticing, right?
mm,
Do we actually notice our emotions? Do we take the time? Do we reflect on them? Do we consider them? The second thing is, can we name them? Because in my world, there's more than 200 emotions, but most people use the same 20 words to name their emotions. They never vary from that vocabulary. So, right, can we name it accurately rather than calling everything anxiety or fear or anger? The third is, do we really understand the structure of the emotion? Like I was saying, the story, the impulse, the purpose. And the fourth is, are we agile? Can we navigate our emotions? Do we make choices about what emotion is going to serve me in that conversation I need to have? Am I agile enough to shift an emotion that I believe is not serving me? And so it's really just these four steps. It's not it's not a terrifically complicated idea, but it's like playing piano, right? You can learn the fundamentals and you can learn how to read music, but then it's all about practice, right? And you just have to practice. There's no shortcut.
Yeah.
And I think that we can do that, but we have to see the value first. If we don't see the value, we won't practice. Just like, your mother sees the value of you playing piano, but you don't. So you don't practice, right? But if you do practice. So, it's the same idea. We just need to see the value first. And then once we do, right, we'll all commit and we'll all practice at some level. And I think, it will grow, right? It'll be exponential. And just like literacy has been exponential in the world, I think that emotional literacy will be as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us today and for sharing your wisdom and your inspiration.
Thank you. My
And
pleasure.
I loved all the nuggets that you've shared. The 3-step process around awareness, choice, and practice, and the 4-step process to implement a practice. Noticing it, and I remember this comes back to me, like name it, claim it, and let it go. So noticing the emotion, naming it, understanding its structure, and then remaining or being present to yourself so that you can remain emotionally agile, to understand what the emotion is telling you and how best you can navigate it, and how best to make the emotion serve you in a way that's moving you forward. Yeah.
A lovely summary. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. So grateful for your time and your presence and your engagement. And I also want to take a minute to thank everyone that watched us live, and to those who will catch the recording. So this was the NorthStar Café, and we've been talking to Dan Newby about emotional literacy as a leadership skill. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to let everyone know that we at the NorthStar Solutions and Services, we are hosting our 4th annual Future of Work conference in commemoration of International Women's Day, and the title is "Burnout: The Silent Pandemic: Creating Sustainable Recovery by Embracing Equity." And this conversation today on emotional literacy, we thought that it dovetailed beautifully with what we are trying to achieve through the conference, which is to support professionals and leaders around the world in, really recognizing and understanding what burnout looks like, and help them get equipped with tools and strategies to not only just recognize what burnout looks like, but also to figure out how to prevent burnout and how to recover safely and sustainably from burnout. So a lot of what you shared today, Dan, here, it really resonates with me, and in the context of what we're thinking about for the conference as well. So really, really appreciate your time. And we invite everyone that's watching live and also catching the replay to join us at the conference on March 15th. All the information is on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook, on all our social media channels, and also our website, northstaratwork.com. So with that, thank you all for joining us, and special gratitude to you, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Take care and be well.